Hi, welcome to the latest episode of Digging for Truth, sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research. Today, I'll be joined by my colleagues, Dr. Scott Stripling and Scott Lancer, as we continue our conversation about archaeological evidence that upholds the reliability of the book of Exodus. We hope you enjoy this interesting and fascinating roundtable discussion.
Gentlemen, we're talking about the exciting archaeological evidence for the early date of the Exodus. Henry and Scott, it's a joyful thing when we look at the biblical data, you look at the archaeological data, and they come together so beautifully. And this is one of the reasons why the early date of the Exodus, it's a good place, a good place to come down on, and it's where the evidence leads us. So we're going to talk some more about that, some more of the archaeological evidence here today. So we're going to talk about, first of all, about the Berlin Pedestal, and the Berlin Stela was one of the primary. You go there, Israel's mentioned there. And then this Berlin Pedestal, hidden away, doesn't come out till later in time. But it's actually, now that work has been done to actually examine it, we see that it is a great testament to Israel and the dating. So, Scott, Henry, why don't we start there?
Well, it's in Berlin.
Yeah, it's in Berlin, yeah.
One of the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. And it is a beautiful synchronism. It dates also to the 14th century BC, and it places Israel in the 14th century BC. So if they arrive at the end of the 15th century, and we have sources that place them, as we saw in the previous episode, we have the Soleb hieroglyph, and we have the Amarna letters. Now we have a third witness placing Israel in the 14th century. It's really pretty powerful. So this is called Pedestal Relief 21687. So they've got a lot of them obviously to deal with, but 21687. It's the base of a huge statue, and so you have there the cartouche, or actually a series of cartouches that are name rings. And so it's listing these places, and there's three of them that we have to deal with, and the order is very interesting. So you have Ashkelon, very ancient, of course, Canaanite site, Phoenician Canaanite site. Then you have Canaan, and then you have Israel. Now here's where, of course, it gets interesting, because the last one, the Israel one, only 2/3 of it exists. 1/3 is broken off on the end. And it seems that it always happened this way. We had an inscription at Shiloh that says, Isis blessed the temple of, and then broken inscription.
Yeah.
The key word that we need is somewhere, we'll get it in wet sifting, hopefully, in the years to come. But if it says Yahweh, then we've got something fascinating, right? Because it shows sort of a syncretism that the Bible describes. Isis blessed the temple of Yahweh. I mean, that's sadly what was going on. So here we've got a partially broken inscription, but Manfred Gorg has done an excellent job, and he published his findings in 2001 of deciphering it as Israel. So when you see what exists of the cartouche and what's missing, then you can say, of those lines that extend out into the missing part, what are the possibilities? Knowing all of the Egyptian iconography, what could it possibly be when it starts like this? And it's just a slam dunk, really. It's Israel, and you have a good number of scholars like Peter van der Veen, for example, who have come along and really fortified and verified this. And it's almost like it's too good to be true. I mean, you have this Berlin Pedestal that is placing Israel in the 14th century.
Yeah, I found this interesting because I remember when I first heard about this, Dr. Wood introduced it in a small article that he wrote on our website, and so then it sort of grew. He put it in an article about 13 years ago, put it on our website, and then the technical academic discussion of it started coming out, and it started vindicating more and more and more that this really does say Israel on the stele. It's really remarkable and extraordinary. Yeah. And I don't think Gorg was an evangelical. Is that correct? So he passed away a few years ago, if I understand right. So again, you can't accuse us of fudging the stuff. I mean, these are secular scholars studying the material. In fact, most of this material we draw on is not our work. We're just finding things that fit with the biblical account. It's extraordinary too, Scott. Interesting. Museum archaeology is a whole nother job that remains out there. How much stuff is sitting in the basement of these museums that hasn't been read or reviewed yet?
Not all excavation is in the field.
Yeah. And some of it's been there for decades or even 100 years.
We just saw a few weeks ago the Pontius Pilate ring, or what appears to be the ring of Pontius Pilate, had been sitting around for decades and hadn't been identified yet.
Yeah, and then they finally got to it.
Yeah, so I was fascinated with Van der Veen. Is the one who did some additional work on this, and this is something our viewers, if you wanted to look into this more, there's some really good literature out there. You can actually read about how he was able to fill in those missing portions of that last cartouche and symbol there, and it's speaking of Israel. It seems to be, like I said, a slam dunk.
Well, the interesting thing also is the order of the names, because it's the identical order that we have on another inscription that is probably the most famous of all, and I think it validates the early date as well, and that is the Merneptah stela.
Yes.
And so shall we delve into that?
Certainly shall.
Well,
go for it.
Well, these three names in the same order, Ashkelon, Canaan, and Israel, appear in the Merneptah stela toward the end of the inscription. And so, of course, Merneptah is a son of Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II. And here's our guy, Flinders Petrie, again, doing his thing. And in Thebes in 1896, he's the one who discovers this, what's sometimes called the Israel Stela or the Victory Stela of Merneptah. Now, I mentioned earlier that Egyptian pharaohs are known for their hyperbole and their exaggeration. It's not that the events didn't occur, it's that they highlight them. I spoke and my enemies melted before me. Well, we don't believe that they literally melted, but but when Tutmosis III uses that type of language, of course, that he literally did conquer Canaan. So now we have Merneptah, who says that around the year 1210, give or take a handful of years, that he has conquered all these places, including Israel. He's laid waste. His seed no longer exists. Well, that's the hyperbole part of it.
Right.
But did he actually conquer these sites? Well, if one were following a 13th century date, is there time for an exodus, a sojourn, a conquest, and establishing a nation by 1210? It doesn't appear to be.
It's only 20 years, right? Don't they put the Exodus around 1230?
That's right.
So it's just not enough time.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And by itself, that would be a good argument, but when we buttress that with the other things that we've already talked about, we've got clear evidence of Israel in the 14th century, and that it happened in the 15th century, then this just fits really nicely with the evidence.
The order of the name places is fascinating to me too, that they're in the same order, but separated in time. It's very interesting. Now, you mentioned Ashkelon before. That's one of the ones that's mentioned. That's one of the Philistine cities of the Pentapolis, right?
Right.
But we're talking about Ashkelon before it's Philistine.
That's right.
Right. So it's Canaanite, or Phoenician, sometimes called in the literature, but it's Canaanite culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So 1177 is our big date for the permanent arrival of the Philistines. Now, you've got biblical texts that indicate that maybe you had Philistines earlier, and possibly you had an attempt at colonization which failed, which we know that from America, of course, failed attempts at colonization.
Yeah.
And then later in 1177, a permanent successful one. So pre-1177 at Ashkelon is definitely a Canaanite culture.
It's Canaanite culture, right.
Absolutely.
So that's what he's referring to, him and both, and in the Berlin Pedestal when it's referring to Ashkelon.
That's right.
So, and this is an important site. It's strategically located and all that. So it all fits.
Couldn't be more important.
Yeah, fits in the context.
You had a massive excavation there that just concluded, and they're in the process of publishing it now.
Yeah.
Now, Here's an interesting idea that I think we need to pursue. If we have a source like Merneptah who is claiming to have destroyed cities in Canaan, he mentions these three in particular, but multiple cities in Canaan at the end of the 13th century. This brings up a point with our late date friends because they find a series of sites destroyed in the late 13th century. It's true. Albright mentioned Tel Bet Merzim and Lachish and Megiddo and several other sites. And they said, well, we got a string of sites that are destroyed at the end of the 13th century. It looks like Joshua's work. So if it's not Joshua, then who could it have been?
Right.
Now, at Hatzor, you could say, well, there's a possibility that Deborah and Barak, have destroyed this, and that certainly could have been. We don't know for sure, but it's a possibility.
Yes.
But it's also possible that Hatzor and these other sites were destroyed by Merneptah. We have a pharaoh taking credit for destroying these sites.
Yes.
Why would we ascribe them to Joshua when we've got Pharaoh himself claiming to have destroyed those sites?
Yeah.
It's interesting when you're talking about that too, because that would so the late date our late date friends are trying to explain that data. That is Joshua who destroyed these cities. But the text of Scripture, I mean, it could be, in theory, but the text only says that Joshua destroyed Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. Right? Because they didn't want to destroy the cities coming into the land. They wanted to preserve them so they could live in them.
Right. Right.
And then the second part is Merneptah's itinerary of destruction more down on the coast, right? Where the biblical account tells us that the Israelites occupied the highlands, and it took really until down to the time of David for them to control the coast.
Sure.
So for people out there just thinking about it, it's possible for the Egyptians to have come into the land while the Israelites were in the hill country.
The Amaras.
The route there. So it's interesting. It fits our model,
right?
But we're explaining it in a different way.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. We've been discussing archaeological evidence related to the book of Exodus. We're going to be picking up our conversation with Dr. Scott Stripling and Scott Lancer. We hope you enjoy it.
Well, we're going to talk for a few minutes about the conquest evidence itself. This is important, and we could do whole shows on some of these things.
But we have already.
That's right. But
trying to tell a biblical archaeologist that he's got 2 minutes to talk about the conquest.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. Let's do the best we can.
All right, we'll give you 3.
Well, Scott, the conquest sites are critical because if they point to the late 15th century and the early 14th century BC, then again that synchronizes very, very well. If they don't, then that's problematic. So the main sites, Henry, I think you just mentioned, the Bible says that 3 cities were burned by the Israelites, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And their motivation to burn cities was very low because God told them, you're going to live in cities you didn't build, you're going to occupy houses you didn't construct, and so forth. So they're not really wanting to burn their inheritance, this generational wealth. But at these sites, I think that we have evidence that matches the biblical account. In Jericho and in Ai, which is, of course, a site that we worked at very diligently for 21 years, and then at Hatzor and Mount Ebal. So for the sake of time, let me just say a few words about Mount Ebal and then a few words about Hatzor.
Great.
In a previous episode, we focused on Mount Ebal, and we said that there was a rectangular altar that dated to the 13th century. And so if one were an advocate of a 13th century Exodus, you could get super excited about that. What we pointed out, which seems to have escaped the attention of scholars and the general public, is that in the dead center of that rectangular altar is a round altar from an earlier time period, which has evidence that leads us to believe that it could very well date exactly to the time of Joshua and could be Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal. And in fact, you have a scarab of Thutmose III that's found there among the remains at the lowest level.
Right. We talked about in that episode too, the archaeologists who discovered that, who moved in the direction of the biblical text in terms of his personal beliefs. I mean, I don't know if he became a Christian, but just his view of the biblical text moved in a conservative direction as a result of this.
He was a secular, Adam Zertal. He was a secularist.
Total secular.
But this caused him to begin to take the biblical text as a serious historical document.
Yeah.
So that's an important conquest site. It shows evidence from the 15th century BC, and it also has LB pottery at those lowest levels, surface 161, pit 250, and those critical things at the lowest level there. Mm-hmm. And then at Hatzor, we have some interesting evidence, and I love Hatzor because there's two destruction layers there. And Henry, I believe you worked for a season at Hatzor when ABR sent a team. You want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, it was in 2007. It was a great experience. Now, we dug in an area that was much up high. It was in the Persian period, but it was my first taste of field archaeology, and it was hot and so on and so forth, but it was awesome, and it would really help. It helped prepare me for more of the work that I've done with ABR going forward. But Hatzor is such an important site. I mean, Joshua, in the book of Joshua, it's referred to as the head of all those kingdoms.
Right.
And in the Amarna letters, I think it's the only place where, if I remember this right, or maybe this is in the biblical text, you have to correct me, that the king is referred to as not as just the king of Hatzor, but the king of Canaan.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right? Is that in the biblical
That's in
text?
the biblical
It's in the biblical text. So it shows you how, and it's a huge site. It's important. It's huge. It's like 200 acres. I think the guy who was excavating it told us that it would take 600 years to excavate the whole site. That's how big it is. Only Jerusalem is bigger in terms of acreage.
Right.
So it's extremely important.
It's massive, and when we look there, do we see evidence of the conquest? There are two destruction layers at Hatzor, and it's very easy to remember because one is what they call stratum 15, and one is stratum 13. And we've been discussing the 15th century and the 13th century.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? What's stratum 15, or stratum in the upper city, stratum 2 in the lower city? But stratum 15 dates to the 15th century. Stratum 13 in the upper city
That's so interesting.
Dates to the 13th century. Okay, so we have two destruction layers, which makes perfect sense. Now, the attempt to assign stratum 13 to Joshua, you can see why that's problematic. Yeah. May very well have been Mereneptah who destroyed that, or
Deborah and Barak.
Deborah and Barak, if you prefer
4.
that.
Yeah.
You have the famous desecration of the cultic area there, the decapitation of these idols. That's in that stratum 13. But this could have any foreign
Sure.
invasion could have done such a thing.
For the Deborah and Barak argument, it's consistent with the command, destroy all their idols.
Yes.
So it's consistent with the data. Because Judges 4, just to clarify, does not say specifically that Deborah and Barak destroyed Hatzor.
Right.
They defeated the king. So it could be implied, but it's not stated.
Right.
Right.
And it very well could be the case.
Yeah.
And it could also be someone else like Mereneptah. But regardless, it's important that we see these two destruction layers. So if the stratum 15 is the destruction from the time of Joshua, then that means that the second destruction layer could be assigned to either Mereneptah or Deborah and Barak, for example.
Yeah, it's important. We're talking about the conquest evidence as it helps us to understand the early date of the Exodus. Mm-hmm. And I would want our viewers to understand that, well, first of all, with Mount Ebal, we are really hoping to get back there, and we'd love to get there and do some work on that earlier altar that's there. But we worked for years, of course, at Khirbet el-Maqader, we believe is the biblical city of Ai. Henry's dug at Hatzor. Dr. Wood's research on Jericho was groundbreaking research. So we have really put the time in here to try to understand the chronologies related to these great historic sites, and we're going to continue that work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
But,
I want to add to that just really quick, a really important point, that in the skeptical or minimalist literature and academic arguments, the origin of the nation of Israel is not from the conquest, meaning in the land. There's other theories. Sure. There's all these different theories. So the importance of the conquest is tied directly to the Exodus, because the Exodus story leads to it. If the conquest didn't really happen, then that just has a domino effect backwards to the Exodus. So, and the Exodus is the central event of Old Testament history, if I could say that way, and it affects our theology of the New Testament. I mean, all the connections are pretty obvious, but so the importance of this can't be overstated, really, in terms of that.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological Evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Welcome back to our final segment of today's episode of Digging for Truth, where we've been discussing archaeological evidence related to the book of Exodus. My colleagues Scott Lancer, co-host of the program, and Dr. Scott Stripling have joined me in the studio as we talk about this fascinating and insightful subject. We hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Well, let's talk a little bit about historians Manetho and Josephus, because that's always an important piece of this whole discussion, looking at what these ancient historians talked about, and it helps us understand the early date of the Exodus.
Well, by itself, we would not take a first century or a second century historian and base our doctrine or belief system upon that. But we are interested in seeing how it synchronizes with all the other data that we've laid out. So Josephus, as we know, is a first century Jewish historian, and he wrote a couple of really big books, Against Appian, The War of the Jews, The Antiquities of the Jews, and he deals with another historian from the previous century. So his name is Manetho, and he's from the Ptolemaic era down in Egypt. He's a priest. And he is laying out a chronology for the Exodus. So down in Egypt, in the Ptolemaic period, about 2nd century BC, how are they understanding the dating of the Exodus? Because Josephus is citing him. Well, he has some very interesting things to say. He seems to be placing it in the reign of one Amenhotep or Amenhotep. Now, the only occurrence of a pharaoh by that name, Amenhotep, we have 4 of them in the 18th dynasty. That's 18th dynasty, that's 15th century. So we've got a 2nd century BC historian saying that it happened during the reign of Amenhotep. We would believe Amenhotep II would fit the best. That's really interesting.
It is.
That we have an independent source that is dating it to that reign. Now, Josephus goes on and sort of draws some conclusion and conflates some of Manetho's dating and tries to place it with the Hyksos, whereas Manetho clearly has these as separate events. The Hyksos are departing from Egypt a century before the Israelites are departing.
Right.
But he does preserve enough of it, Josephus does, so that we can clearly understand what Manetho was saying.
Yeah. So again, it's another issue of we treat Josephus fairly, but he also, it looks like he messed some things up after that. You were talking about he conflates different things because maybe he didn't understand the source correctly, or historians do that. We give him the benefit of the doubt, but we have the ability to test his statements with the other data. So he's drawing on the history of Manetho, who has documented Egyptian history, right?
Yes.
So he's got a source.
Sure.
So we're back to Josephus, who has a source that goes all the way back into the 2nd century. That's important for us to evaluate, to put that on the scale and see how it goes.
Well, what we've done in these episodes, this series of episodes on the dating of the Exodus and the Conquest, is we worked through 6 different passages of Scripture and then 8 archaeological and epigraphic indicators and pieces of evidence. 6 plus 8. So we've explored 14 areas of evidence, and they've all pointed us to the same place, to the 15th century BC. And so this gives us great confidence as we excavate, because we're in that very context right now where we're excavating at Shiloh, for example. It gives us great confidence that we're looking in the right time, at the right place, for the right stuff.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, this is exciting stuff, because as much as chronology can be exciting, we find it exciting because it drives us back to the text of the Bible. And the history of the text. And we hope our viewers have appreciated this discussion. I know I have.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this discussion today about archaeology related to the book of Exodus. As you can see, there are amazing discoveries that uphold and affirm the reliability of the biblical text. The Christian has nothing to fear as it relates to digging in the archaeological world. We can be confident that you can trust the Scriptures, especially these momentous events recorded in Exodus. Thank you for joining us today.